10 minutes before I walked down the aisle, I heard a sentence that made it clear this wasn't my wedding. It was my turn. "I told you it's fine," my future mother-in-law said, her voice low and steady like she was reading from a note card. "We already handled it once. We can handle it again." The hallway outside the bridal room was narrow, carpeted in that hotel pattern swirls that always look clean until you stare too long. And I was standing barefoot on it in a full wedding dress because my shoes were inside, because my bouquet was inside, because my whole life was inside that room and I'd stepped out for one single breath. I froze with my hand still on the door handle, my veil brushing my shoulder, my chest tightening so fast it felt like my ribs were shrinking, and I remember thinking, I don't even know what it is, but they're talking like I'm not supposed to. My name is Paige Holloway, and I was 29 years old that morning, already zipped into ivory satin, already wearing a ring that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone who hadn't been paying attention. The ceremony music was faint through the walls, soft piano, and that distant hum of guests settling, the kind of sound that's supposed to make you feel safe, like everything is in place. Behind me, the bridal suite smelled like hairspray and warm fabric and peonies sitting in water, and my phone was on a folding chair where I'd left it face down so I wouldn't obsess over texts. I'd stepped out because my stomach was flipping, and the shapewear under my dress was squeezing my lungs, and the coordinator had just said, 10 minutes, like time was an ingredient she could measure. I didn't mean to listen. I was just standing there trying to breathe normally when I heard my future sister-in-law answer, "I'm not the one who opened this, Mom." She sounded tight, not panicked, not guilty, just annoyed, like she was tired of being the person who gets handed messes. I shifted my weight and the lace at my sleeve scratched my wrist, a tiny sensation that felt weirdly loud in my body. I cracked the door open just enough to see the hallway without stepping into it, and I saw them. Marlene, my fiancé's mother, in a navy dress that matched the wedding colors too perfectly to be an accident, pearls at her ears, lipstick flawless, posture upright like she was posing even when she wasn't, and Kendra, his older sister, in a dark green dress, holding her phone and turning it over and over like she couldn't decide whether to hide it or throw it. Marlene's hand was on Kendra's forearm in a way that looked affectionate from a distance, but up close, it was control. And then Marlene said, "You don't say a word to her. Not today." She didn't say my name. She didn't need to. I was the only her that mattered right now. Kendra's eyes flicked toward the bridal room, toward my door, and my skin went hot. But she didn't look long enough to register me, or she did and chose not to. She said, "He's not even nervous. That's what's making me sick." Her voice dropped even lower, like she was embarrassed by the fact she cared. Marlene gave this short exhale that almost sounded like a laugh. "Of course he's not," she said. "He knows how this goes." My first thought tried to be reasonable, because that's what I've always done when things feel off. Maybe a vendor forgot something, maybe there was an issue with the seating chart, maybe the photographer double-booked. The kind of problem adults solve quietly. But my body didn't buy that story for even a second. My hands started shaking, and I pressed my palm to the door to steady it, because if the latch clicked, they'd turn and I'd have to pretend I hadn't just heard my future mother-in-law talk like this day was a routine. Marlene leaned closer to Kendra, and I heard her say, "He's going to settle. He always does. Eventually. Eventually." Like being a good husband was a phase he'd grow into if everyone just kept things smooth long enough. Kendra's jaw flexed and she said, "And if she finds out?" Again, no name. Just she. Like I was a category. Marlene didn't hesitate. "She won't," she said. "Not today. And if she does later, we'll do what we did last time." Then her eyes dropped to Kendra's phone, and her voice sharpened just a little, the only crack in her calm. "Delete it. Now." Last time. Those two words hit harder than anything else because they weren't a threat or a guess. They were history. They were familiarity. They were proof that this wasn't some first-time panic. This was a process, a thing with steps. Kendra paused, thumb hovering over the screen, and Marlene's fingers tightened on her arm. Kendra tapped once, twice, and then she swallowed like she hated herself for obeying. I couldn't see what she deleted, and that made my stomach drop even further, because whatever it was, it mattered enough to erase before I walked out in front of everyone. Marlene nodded like a manager approving a completed task. "Good," she said. "We do not do drama. We do not do scenes. We get through the day and we keep our mouths shut." Then she added, so softly it felt like it slipped out without meaning to, "This is his wedding, not hers." I felt my face go numb, not because I was shocked that a mother could be protective, but because she didn't sound protective. She sounded practiced, like I was an obstacle between her son and the life he was meant to keep living uninterrupted. A laugh floated down the hallway from somewhere closer to the sanctuary, and I realized my guests were out there smiling and checking the program and fixing their hair, thinking they were about to watch two people promise each other a future. I was 10 minutes away from walking toward a man whose family was quietly managing something around him, something they were so sure of they could discuss it in the open as long as they kept their voices low. My phone buzzed inside the bridal room, muffled against the chair cushion, and the vibrations sounded like a warning siren to me. I slipped back into the room and closed the door without making a sound, then stood with my back against it like that could keep reality out. My bouquet sat in its plastic vase on the table, white roses and eucalyptus arranged so perfectly it looked fake. The hem of my dress pooled around my feet like a spill. My shoes waited under the chair like I was about to step into a simple life. I crossed to the mirror, the big, full-length one they'd leaned against the wall for photos, and I stared at myself until my eyes started to sting. I looked like a bride. I looked calm. I looked like the kind of woman who would believe the version of the story everyone else wanted her to believe. I lifted my hands and adjusted my veil with fingers that were suddenly steadier than they should have been, and I watched my own face change in real time, not dramatically, not with tears, just with a quiet shift like a door closing inside me. What hit me hardest wasn't even suspicion yet. It wasn't the shape of an affair. It was the certainty that there was a secret, and they were managing it, and I was the last person they'd ever planned to tell. The coordinator knocked lightly and called, 2 minutes, Paige, and I didn't answer right away. I just kept looking at my reflection, hearing Marlene's voice in my head like a chant. Handled it once, handle it again. If they believed I was clueless, if they thought I was just a bride floating toward vows like a sleepwalker, then they'd keep talking. They'd keep slipping. They'd keep getting careless. And that meant I had one thing they didn't think I had: time. Time is leverage. I smiled at my reflection, practiced and small, then turned toward the door as if nothing in the world had changed, even though my whole body knew I was about to walk into something I didn't understand yet, something that had already happened before. And as I reached for the handle, my phone lit up with a new notification on the chair, screen glowing bright against the fabric, and the name on it made my stomach drop all over again. I said, "I do," knowing I was marrying into a system, not a man. When the doors opened and the music swelled, my body moved on autopilot, because that's what years of being agreeable trains you to do. And I walked down the aisle smiling at faces that blurred together, while my mind cataloged everything that didn't belong to me. The flowers were exactly where Marlene had insisted they be. The seating was exactly as she'd rearranged it 2 days earlier, for balance. Even the pacing of the ceremony felt managed, like there was an invisible hand nudging us forward whenever we lingered too long. I caught my fiancé's eyes at the altar, and he smiled the way he always did, relaxed, confident, unbothered, like a man certain nothing could go wrong because nothing ever really did for him. He didn't squeeze my hands too tight. He didn't fumble his words. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, he didn't even glance around. His family, seated in the first rows, looked calm in a way that made my skin prickle. Not emotional, not tense, just watchful, like they were monitoring a process they trusted. When it came time for vows, he spoke smoothly, hit all the right notes, talked about partnership and honesty with a straight face that would have convinced me a week earlier. I felt my mouth form the words I'd practiced, felt my voice sound steady, and I wondered if this was what self-betrayal felt like in real time. At the reception, everything flowed like it had been rehearsed. Marlene hugged me first, tight and brief, whispering, "You were beautiful," without warmth or curiosity, like she was complimenting the centerpiece. Kendra smiled and avoided my eyes, then handed me a drink I hadn't asked for, already opened, saying, "You must be exhausted," like it was an instruction. His cousins joked loudly, his aunts dabbed at dry eyes, and he moved through the room with ease, laughing at the right moments, checking in with everyone except me. When I did catch his arm and lean in, he smiled down at me and said, "We did it," with relief instead of joy. I started noticing the looks, the quick exchanges between Marlene and Kendra when someone mentioned college friends, the way his uncle laughed a beat too late at certain jokes, like he was waiting for a cue, the comment one groomsman made during dinner, clinking his glass and saying, "Here's to finally settling him down," followed by a chorus of knowing chuckles that didn't reach their eyes. I smiled through all of it, nodded, ate 3 bites of chicken I couldn't taste, and memorized who looked at whom when certain words were said. At one point, while we were cutting the cake, someone shouted, "Careful, he's had practice," and the room laughed again. I felt his hand tighten just slightly on mine, not in fear, in warning, and when I looked up at him, he leaned in and murmured, "Ignore them," like he was used to smoothing things over before I even noticed them. The band started playing louder, the moment passed, and Marlene caught my eye from across the room and lifted her glass to me in a small, satisfied toast. I didn't cry. I didn't confront. I didn't ask a single question. I did what I've always done when something feels off, and everyone around me seems invested in pretending it's fine. I watched. I listened. I stored details away like evidence, not because I knew what I'd do with them yet, but because I knew I'd need them. Later, when I slipped away to the restroom just to stand alone for a minute, I overheard Kendra telling one of his friends, "She's easygoing. That helps." And the friend replied, "Yeah, she seems calm, like calm was a quality they'd selected for." When I came out, they both stopped talking and smiled too quickly. I smiled back and walked past them, my heels clicking against the tile, my reflection in the mirror looking composed enough to fool even me. By the time the night wound down and the last song played, I understood one thing clearly. This wedding wasn't about beginning something new, it was about maintaining something old. A pattern, a balance. Everyone else seemed to know their role, and mine was to be agreeable, grateful, quiet. As we said our goodbyes, a distant relative I'd barely spoken to all day hugged me loosely and said, almost offhand, "Well, at least this one seems calmer than the last." The worst part wasn't the betrayal, it was realizing how well they'd rehearsed it. The first week after the wedding passed in a blur of thank you notes, leftover cake in the fridge, and people calling to say how perfect everything had been. And I played my part so convincingly that even I almost believed it. We were back in our apartment, the one we'd toured together with coffee in our hands, and dreams spilling out of us. And I watched him settle back into his routines, like nothing in his life had shifted at all. He left his shoes in the same spot by the door. He kissed my cheek the same way, quick and distracted. He said, "Work's crazy" on Tuesday, client dinner on Thursday, and guys' night on Saturday, and every explanation came prepackaged, smooth, unchallenged, like he'd said them 100 times before. I told myself I was overreacting. I told myself weddings scramble your nerves, that I'd overheard something out of context, that families are weird and overbearing and sometimes say stupid things under stress. I stood in the kitchen one morning, rinsing coffee mugs, watching sunlight hit the counter, and I literally said out loud, "You're exaggerating," like I could talk myself back into the woman I'd been before that hallway. He walked up behind me, wrapped his arms around my waist, and said, "You okay?" With a softness that almost worked, and I nodded because it was easier than asking what he'd need to lie about first. But then the pattern started showing itself in small, undeniable ways. When he said he'd be home by 9 and walked in closer to midnight without apology, when his phone buzzed on the table and he flipped it face down without looking, emotion so practiced it barely registered to him. When I asked casually how his sister was doing and he answered too quickly, "Fine," like the topic made him nervous. And every time something didn't add up, there was a safety net waiting underneath it. His mother texting to say he was helping her with something. His sister mentioning a story that conveniently filled in a gap. It wasn't just him lying to my face. It was an entire support system catching him mid-fall. The first real emotional loss hit me one quiet evening when I realized I couldn't trust my own reactions anymore. I'd always thought of myself as intuitive, someone who reads people well, and suddenly I was second-guessing every feeling, every raised eyebrow, every late arrival. I lay in bed next to him, listening to his breathing, even out as he fell asleep, staring at the ceiling, feeling lonelier than I ever had living alone. Whatever was happening wasn't just taking him away from me, it was taking me away from myself. I didn't start digging right away. I waited, I watched, I paid attention to the everyday details that don't feel dramatic enough to matter until they pile up. I noticed the way Marlene always knew where he was before I did. The way Kendra answered questions for him at family dinners, cutting him off with a laugh and saying, "He's terrible with details," when really she was steering the story. I noticed how comfortable they all were with half-truths, how no one ever seemed confused or surprised by anything he did. The first time I checked his phone, my hands were shaking so badly I had to sit down. He'd left it charging on the nightstand while he showered, steam filling the bathroom, the sound of water loud enough to give me cover. I hated myself in that moment, hated that this was who I was becoming, but I hated not knowing more. I didn't scroll wildly. I didn't dig through years. I looked for patterns, message threads muted but not deleted, names saved as initials, gaps in conversations that lined up too neatly with his late nights. Nothing explosive, nothing I could point to and say, "There, that's it," just enough to tell me I wasn't imagining things. When I confronted him gently, because that's how I've always confronted people, he didn't miss a beat. He smiled, touched my arm, and said, "You're tired. We've both been off since the wedding." And his eyes stayed steady on mine as he said it, like he'd practiced that too. I felt something in me go cold then, because lying straight to someone's face requires a kind of confidence that doesn't come from panic. It comes from experience. The ally I didn't expect came from outside the family. A coworker of his, someone I'd met once at a holiday party, ran into me at the grocery store and mentioned casually that she'd seen him out the week before, with a woman from the old team, then froze when she saw my expression and said, "Oh, I just assumed you knew." Like that was the most natural thing in the world. I smiled, thanked her, finished shopping on autopilot, and cried in my car so hard I couldn't drive for 10 minutes. That was the moment everything shifted from emotional to practical. I stopped asking him questions I didn't need answers to. I stopped looking for reassurance. I started documenting. Dates when he said one thing and did another. Messages that lined up with his family's cover stories. Times his mother's explanations contradicted his sister's. I wasn't collecting drama. I was collecting structure. And then one night, while helping Marlene clean up after a family dinner, she slipped. It was small. A comment about a place he always took her, said without thinking, then quickly corrected. But the way Kendra's eyes snapped to her mother's face told me everything. I smiled, kept stacking plates, and felt something settle into place. Whatever this was, it wasn't just his secret anymore. And for the first time, I had proof that tied his family directly to the deception. Proof I hadn't even finished uncovering yet. I didn't dig. I waited. And they gave me everything. Once I stopped reacting, once I stopped asking questions and looking for reassurance like a tell, they relaxed in a way that was almost insulting. The tension I'd felt in the first weeks after the wedding dissolved, replaced by something like confidence, as if my silence confirmed every assumption they'd made about me. He went back to being openly careless, leaving the room to take calls without explanations, coming home with stories that were thinner each time, and his family stopped coordinating as tightly because they didn't think they needed to anymore. It turns out people only stay sharp when they think they're being watched. Everyday life kept moving around the secret like it always does. Laundry piled up, groceries ran out. I learned the rhythm of our evenings, the way he'd loosen his tie and talk about work while avoiding specifics, the way he'd scroll on his phone with his thumb angled away from me. I cooked dinners and listened without interrupting, nodded at the right moments, and filed things away. When Marlene texted updates about him before he got home, I stopped responding immediately. When Kendra filled in stories for him at Sunday lunches, I let her talk. The more space I gave them, the more they filled it. The first real slip happened because of timing, not carelessness. He told me he'd be out of town for 2 days for meetings, something his mother confirmed unprompted over coffee, adding details I hadn't asked for. That same evening, Kendra mentioned, while complaining about traffic, that she'd seen his car near a restaurant across town earlier that day. She caught herself halfway through the sentence, laughed it off, and said, "You know how similar cars look, but the damage was done. 2 versions of the same day, overlapping where they shouldn't." Messages started appearing at the wrong times. Notifications lighting up his phone at midnight when he was asleep beside me. A name I didn't recognize popping up during dinner, then disappearing from the screen entirely the next day. Once, at another family gathering, someone mentioned the other woman without meaning to, correcting themselves so quickly it was almost impressive, but the phrase hung in the air just long enough for me to feel it land. No one apologized. No one explained. They all just watched my face, waiting to see if I'd react. I realized then that this wasn't new. The ease with which they covered for him, the shorthand they used, the way Marlene spoke about his behavior like it was a phase he cycled through, all of it pointed to history. There had been others before me. Women who'd asked questions, women who'd been managed, women who'd been quieted or written off. I wasn't special. I was current. I chose the timing carefully, not a confrontation, not a dramatic exit. I agreed to a large family gathering Marlene had been planning for weeks. A weekend dinner with extended relatives and friends, people from different parts of his life who rarely overlapped. She framed it as a chance to celebrate us properly now that the wedding stress was over. I smiled and said yes, and she looked relieved, like she'd passed some invisible test. In the days leading up to it, I finished preparing. I didn't rehearse speeches. I didn't plan accusations. I made sure my facts were clean, verifiable, impossible to wave away as emotion. I confirmed timelines. I saved messages. I noted who had said what and when. I watched how comfortable they were, how unguarded, how convinced that I was still playing my role. The night before the gathering, he kissed me goodnight and said, "Mom's excited." Like that was supposed to mean something to me. I lay awake long after he fell asleep, staring at the ceiling, not feeling nervous or scared, just focused. There's a strange calm that comes when you finally stop hoping for a different outcome. The morning of the dinner, Marlene called to go over details, seating, timing, who was bringing what, controlling the narrative before it even started. I listened, agreed, thanked her, and hung up. When I looked around our apartment, at the life I'd stepped into so willingly, it didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like a stage I was about to leave. I got dressed carefully that evening, not like a woman preparing for a fight, but like someone attending an ending. As we walked out the door together, he reached for my hand, confident, relaxed, and I let him take it, knowing it was the last time I would play along. They thought I was still clueless. They had no idea I'd already decided where this would end. I didn't accuse anyone. I just stopped protecting their lies. The house was already loud when we arrived, voices overlapping, glasses clinking, Marlene moving through the rooms like a director checking her marks, greeting everyone with the same bright smile she'd used at the wedding. This was the setting she'd chosen because it was safe, because it was familiar, because she believed she controlled it. Extended family, old friends, a few professional connections of his, people who knew different versions of him but had never seen them side by side. I kissed cheeks, accepted compliments, thanked people for coming, and felt strangely detached, like I was watching myself from a distance. Dinner unfolded exactly as expected. Stories, laughter, his confidence growing with every minute, because nothing was happening. When someone asked how married life was treating us, he answered easily, "Great," and squeezed my knee under the table. A gesture meant to look affectionate, but felt more like a reminder to stay in line. Marlene watched me closely, relaxed only when I smiled and nodded, when I didn't challenge anything. Kendra avoided my eyes altogether. After dessert, when coffee was poured and people settled into that comfortable sprawl where attention drifts but ears stay open, I stood up. I didn't clink a glass. I didn't raise my voice. I just said, calmly, "I want to clear something up." And the room shifted in that subtle way it does when people sense a change in tone. He looked up at me, surprised for the first time in weeks. I started with facts, dates, times. I mentioned a trip he said was for work that overlapped with a dinner his sister had said he attended locally. I mentioned messages sent while he was supposedly asleep beside me. I mentioned cover stories that didn't match, explanations that changed depending on who told them. I didn't say the word affair. I didn't have to. I watched faces around the room change as people did the math themselves. Then I let them speak. He tried first, laughing lightly, saying I was confused, that there were misunderstandings. Marlene jumped in too quickly, correcting him, offering a version that contradicted his. Kendra tried to smooth it over, then stopped mid-sentence when she realized she was making it worse. One by one, they talked, and with every attempt to regain control, the story fractured further. The room went quiet, not shocked, but uncomfortable, because this wasn't drama, this was exposure. When it was clear the truth couldn't be stitched back together, I delivered the final fact, the one I hadn't shared with anyone yet. I told them that I'd already filed the paperwork, that our finances were separated, that I wasn't asking permission or understanding or apologies. I wasn't there to negotiate, I was there to stop lying for them. The unexpected consequence wasn't his reaction, it was Marlene's. She didn't rage, she didn't cry. She went still, eyes hard, calculating losses instead of damage, and I realized in that moment that she'd always known how this would end. Just not like this. Not publicly, not without control. I left before anyone could corner me, questions buzzing behind me like static. Outside, the night air felt cold and clean, and for the first time in a month, I could breathe without forcing it. I'd thought revenge would feel like victory. Instead, it felt like stepping into an uncertain silence, knowing I'd burned something down and would have to live with the smoke. And now I'm curious, what do you think about what I did? Would you have handled it differently? And if this story made you feel something, leave a comment, like the video, and subscribe to the channel.